Ah, I know it well. The Beast and the Beauty.
Manoli, I'm out of room on my card.
I told you.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna use my phone.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Hold on one second. I'm gonna get it on my phone. I don't see my phone. Hold on one second. Does anybody have a phone?
Well, I've got a phone.
Oh, perfect.
Let me unlock it.
Do you see a phone?
Video?
Awesome.
Well, thank you all so much. And thank, in particular, the two organizers, Marcia and Zach, who represent almost opposite ends of the spectrum of my students over the years. I have to say, since a lot of people have been congratulating me on my birthday, it's not actually my birthday. So they were just a little slow. And my 70th birthday happened in December of last year. So I'm almost 71.
I think it's your 70th birthday until it's your 71st birthday.
It is.
Yeah, there you go.
And that was exactly the
Check your trunk function at the door.
I suggested that, you know, they could wait until I turned 75 maybe, but Marcia was suggesting that maybe I wouldn't last that long. So here we are. Anyway, I'm deeply honored. I also want to thank Fern and Samantha for doing the organization of things like the refreshments and the food and so on. And Zach managed to wangle this room. By the way, I have to say, I have very bad memories of this room. In 1976, I think, or maybe 75 even, Walter Rosenbluth, who was the provost of MIT, asked me to serve on a committee that was organized by, I think it was Tostason was dean then.
Yep.
Where he got together in this room around the giant table, all of the different people in the Harvard medical system who had computers. And his charge to this gathering was to come up with some coherent idea about how to share resources and how to organize computation in the medical field at Harvard. And he asked me, as somebody who had just recently gotten into the field, to come and attend and help them with technical things or something like that. So I come here, I sit down. Tostason is sitting at the head of the table over on that side, and he turns to the first guy next to him and says, so let's go around the table and everybody just let us know what kind of computer your lab has so that we have some idea of the inventory of different computational capabilities. And the first guy he turns back to him and says, I don't want to tell you. And that was essentially the end of the meeting because nobody was willing to say what they had because they figured that somebody would then want to use it and they weren't going to share. And so it was a total disaster. So that was my first experience with this particular room.
So the question is, have we come a long way?
Yes, we have come
we actually have.
We like different.
We actually have come a long way. The other thing I noticed walking in today, so I don't think I've been back here since then, was that it was all dead white males around the wall. And now I see that we have a handful of women and even an African-American portrait.
But did you know that why we took the picture in that corner?
Yes, I figured. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit. Oops.
Oh, you did. Don't worry. I turned it off while you were speaking.
Okay. All right. Yes. Okay, so this is where I come from. That charming couple in the upper left are my parents. As Zach said in his introduction, my mother was at Auschwitz and survived. She weighed 22 kilos at the end of World War II, and was taken by the Red Cross to Sweden, where the Swedes nursed her back to health, and she came back to Hungary. My dad was in a labor battalion where the commander of that battalion liked him because he was a shoemaker, and so he could fix the boots of the German and Austrian soldiers that he was attached to. But when he returned, he discovered that his wife and kid had been murdered by the Nazis. And so it was a pretty tough time. Charming Central Europe. So nevertheless, actually, they told me that originally they decided they weren't going to have children. And then my mother's brother and his wife got pregnant with my cousin, and my parents just persuaded my parents that they should also have a kid. And so I owe my life to my cousin. Never lets me forget it. So let's see. This is me at age 1.
What a cute little girl.
So cute.
I was not a girl, but as far as I know, but it was more unisex clothing. This was my favorite toy. Was a little rocking horse made of rubber, and if you squeezed it, it squeaked.
You don't remember this, do you?
So that toy was with me until I was 8 when we left Hungary, and I didn't bring it. So I do remember the toy, but not from that age.
Yeah.
The other great story that my parents told me was that my birthday happens to be the same as Joseph Stalin's birthday.
Oh no.
There's some controversy about exactly when Stalin was born, but in Hungary they celebrated it on my birthday. So I was born in a little village in the eastern part of Hungary that didn't have electricity when I was born, and they were just installing electric power, and they turned it on Stalin's birthday. And my parents tell me that I was convinced that this was in my honor. And they had a hell of a time getting me to go to sleep. I wanted to watch the lights. So this is me growing up as a little tyke in Hungary. This is learning to swim in Balaton, which is the great Hungarian sea. It's really a lake, but you know, it's a small country. And this is me with my cousin to whom I owe my life. And you know, later pictures. In the aftermath of the Hungarian Revolution.
You have already that look, I have to say. I know that look.
But now I see your son. Now your son is much clearer.
Yeah, yeah. When he was little, he looked a lot like me. So the Hungarian Revolution happened in the fall of 1956. And I remember my dad coming home very late from work because he was caught up in the traffic and the marches and the whatever, and the subway or the tram wasn't running very well. And so my mother was worried sick that he was dead in the streets because that had happened to people. But he came home, and I remember, I do actually remember him getting my mom and me together, and he said, "This is a momentous day for us. It means that we're leaving." And then it took us about 4 or 5 months before we actually were able to get out. But we left in early 1957 and arrived in Vienna.
What fraction of Hungarians, or how many Hungarians left at that period?
So estimates vary, but it was close to 10%. of Hungarians left.
And what fraction of the ones who tried?
Sorry?
What fraction of the ones who tried?
So there were very few who actually got killed in trying, but progressively it became harder and harder. So we didn't try leaving until December. The revolution was in October. And by December, the Russians had moved back in, and the border was well guarded in some places and not well guarded in other places. So our first attempt to leave, we had hired a guide who supposedly knew where the border was not well guarded and had some friendly farmers in the neighborhood who were going to sneak us across into Austria. But by then, the secret police were checking all the trains going anywhere near the border. And although they bought my family's story, they didn't buy our guide's story. And so they took him off the train.
The professional.
So we arrived in a town near the border, and we had no idea what to do next because our contact was gone. So anyway, we went through a bunch of attempts like this, and finally, my parents bribed somebody in the passport office to issue us a fake passport with which we did get out. And I distinctly remember being on the train and looking back at the border post as we were in no man's land between Hungary and Austria. And I was only 8, but I remember saying, phew, we're not going to get shot. So it was fun times. Anyway, this is me in Austria with my classmates at an elementary school, which I had a chance to revisit recently. On the small world front, a woman who lived 2 doors down from us on our street attended that same elementary school, but about 10 years earlier than I did. And so we discovered this just in casual conversation at one point. So this is me looking awkward in junior high school. And this is me looking awkward in college. And eventually, as a draft dodge, I joined the Air Force, ROTC, because my draft board was about to draft me and send me as a foot soldier to Vietnam. And instead, I became an Air Force officer. And then fortunately for me, I didn't wind up like Mike, having to do my 4 years of service, because the Vietnam War ended just about the time I was finishing my PhD. And they didn't need all these superfluous Air Force officers. And so they gave me the option of doing 3 months of active duty, followed by 10 years in the reserves, which I gladly took. That allowed me to come to MIT and become a professor. This is my graduation. I think this is my PhD graduation, although I'm not wearing my hood yet, with my parents, proud parents. And this is my wife, who at the time was my girlfriend. She was pretty hot, and we had a good time hiking around in Yosemite and going interesting places. And this is us leaving California for Massachusetts in 1974. And this is us eventually getting married in 1979. So we lived in sin. Bill Martin, who you'll see in a few minutes, used to call her my spose, as in, suppose they're getting married.
Can you explain the sudden appearance of the beard?
The sudden appearance of the beard was actually the first trip to Talbot House that was mentioned earlier, when I forgot to bring my razor. And so we spent several days at Talbot House, and it itched like hell. But then, having gotten past that itchy stage, I said, well, here's a chance to have a beard. And so I grew, and then I just never stopped.
Did Diana have anything to say about this?
She didn't mind. I think when my kids were little, I threatened to shave at some point, and they said, no, we won't recognize you. So I've kept it all this time. It used to be longer, as you can see. And then these two little kids who you've also seen in one of the pictures happened. This is my daughter Lisa and my son Daniel with Lisa. They were cute. And this is unfortunately one of the last pictures of my wife who died a couple of years ago of cancer with my kids. So that's been my family life, fun. And I must say my parents really instilled in me all of those wonderful characteristics that people are complimenting me on nowadays, which is kind of nice. My mom wanted to be a doctor. She did about 1.5 years of medical school at the Sorbonne before the Nazis took over and destroyed the world. She never went back to school afterwards. My dad always wanted to be an electrical engineer, but times were tough. He didn't have a chance to go to college. He put his youngest brother through engineering school. He became a mechanical engineer, and then unfortunately got killed in World War II. But his claim to fame was that there was a national competition for high school math students. And one year he beat John von Neumann in that competition. So he was pretty good, but I never knew him. So my intellectual history. This was my PhD thesis, which is now totally embarrassing. It would be something that I could give as a term project in a class, but this was literally done using punch card technology, and so it seemed more impressive at the time. My thesis advisor was Fred Thompson, and he really did look about like this at the time. His thesis advisor was Alfred Tarski, who some of you may recognize as one of the preeminent logicians of the 20th century. This is kind of a funny tribute to him. The sentence, "Snow is white," is true if and only if snow is white, which seems fairly trivial. But in fact, this was his major contribution to logic, was model theory and the whole idea that you could interpret logical sentences in terms of a model world that they described. And that he created something called the theory of truth, of which this is a kind of caricature. I only met him once. He came and gave a talk at UCLA. I went to see him. I didn't understand a word of what he was saying.
And you kept interrupting him.
No, I did not interrupt him. So then when I graduated, or when I was getting my PhD, I had always wanted to be a professor. I think from age 10 or something, or maybe 13, I decided that this was the perfect life. I enjoyed interacting with people. I enjoyed telling stories. I enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed doing all these things. But I had no idea whether I would get to be a professor because, you know, who knows? And when I went on the job market, I got a couple of job offers in research labs. I got a job offer to go run a data center somewhere, which struck me as a terrible thing to want to do. And then I met Jack Schwartz, this guy, at a conference where I was giving a talk. And just to give you a sense of how much more informal things were at the time, Jack heard my talk, came up to me at the coffee break and said, "I want to hire you." Okay, so that was my interview. And then he said, "Oh, you ought to come to," he was chairman at Quran Institute at NYU. And he said, "Well, you got to come and give a talk and we'll go through the usual procedures, but you got a job if you want it."
Same thing today.
It's not like that today.
Well,
At
we
least
We'll talk later.
we'll talk later.
Okay. So that meant that I had to come to the East Coast, and so I made a more general interview trip out of it. And I had a wonderful time. So I met Alan Newell at Carnegie Mellon. And Alan was just the most wonderful person and wonderful thinker and advisor. And even though I wound up, I did get an offer from them, but I wanted to avoid Raj Reddy, because Raj wanted me to work on speech. And I didn't want to work on speech. This was 1974. Real speech didn't happen for a long, long time afterwards. And so I said, I don't want to do that. And
As opposed to medical decision-making automation, which happened immediately.
that happened immediately, exactly. So I wound up coming to MIT, where my mentor was Bill Martin, who unfortunately passed away in 1981. But another contrast was I met Terry Winograd, who was graduating from MIT, and he was immensely helpful to me in understanding A, how to get a job at MIT, and B, how to live at MIT if I did come here. Although Terry left just after giving me this advice and became a professor at Stanford. By contrast, is this being recorded? So, Gene Charniak was Terry's office mate, and I remember having a really bad interaction with him because I walked into the office looking for Terry, who wasn't there, and Gene said, "So who are you?" And I said, "I'm Pete Szolovits. I'm a grad student at Caltech." And he said something like, "Caltech never does anything interesting." And that was the end of the conversation. So I said, well, "That's pleasant." So that was what some of the world was like in those days. So having arrived as a brand new faculty member, I had to figure out what to do. I clearly didn't want to do what I had been working on for my doctoral thesis, which was the design of programming languages specialized to particular domains, because it didn't seem like that deep a problem, although maybe it was, but I just didn't see it. And so I started looking around. I was interested in finding an application area for artificial intelligence, because I figured that I wasn't smart enough to solve the AI problem, but maybe if I limited it to some particular domain, I might be smart enough to do something interesting with it. And so I ran into Howie Silverman, who was a contemporary of Charlie Safran's that you heard from earlier today. And Howie explained to me that he was working with a group of doctors at Tufts under the direction of Tony Gorey, who was indeed the founder of MedG. And Tony decamped to become eventually vice president of research at Baylor, at Texas Medical Center. So I wound up inheriting his group and his grant from NIH, which was very helpful. So anyway, Howie introduced me to this guy, Steve Pauker, who was, still is, no, he was a young cardiologist. He's no longer young. And Steve was really interested in the application of decision analysis to individual decision making in the clinic, and was one of the pioneers of that work. Here you see a decision tree drawn on the board. This is Tony Gorey. This is Bill Schwartz, who became another collaborator, and Jerry Kassir became another collaborator. Bill was chief of medicine at Tufts and had written a monumentally foresightful paper in 1970 talking about what the world of medicine in the year 2000 was going to look like. And it was going to be human doctors assisted by intelligent computers.
Can you pause for a second? I could use another phone because this is out of battery. I mean, out of space. Oops. Sorry. If somebody could call, I don't know. Oh, there's my phone. I got it.
Okay.
I'm good.
So my camera's out of space. My phone is out of space.
Too much good material.
Yeah.
Hold on 1 second. Take it away.
So Bill had written this article called Medicine and the Computer,
Yeah.
the Promise and Problems of Change. And he predicted that we would have the symbiosis between human doctors and computers that would remember all the factual things and help interpret them and so on. And he predicted that, for example, medical school would undergo a dramatic alteration where communication skills and humanistic values would become much more important in the selection of medical students, because the computers would be able to help with all of the technical aspects of being a doctor. So Bill died in about 2007 or 8 or something, but in the year 2000, which is what he had predicted, he was still very much alive. And I remember calling him up and giving him a hard time about
But Hinton actually now says literally the same thing.
Yeah, but everybody always says the same thing. Last year I reviewed a book by Eric Topol called Deep Medicine for Science, and I was reminding people about Bill's predictions in 1970, because Topol is making exactly the same predictions in 2019. So things don't change on that front.
Oh, and Bill Schwartz did discover a disease, syndrome of inappropriate.
SIADH. Yeah. No, he was a big deal guy.
Yeah.
He used to torture dogs in hyperbaric chambers and things like that.
Everybody has their shtick.
So Kassirer, I didn't work with that closely, but Jerry became the executive editor of the New England Journal, so he became a big deal person also. I love Steve. I just saw him yesterday, and he's still very much with us. So these are some early pictures. My lab director was Mike Tertuzos, a wonderful paterfamilias who really believed in the importance of having this rather large laboratory be a family and not just a place where intellectual pursuits happen. And then Bob Fano had been the previous director. Corby, or Fernando Corbido, who just died recently, was head of the Multics project, which some of you may have heard of. And then this is Patrick Winston and Joel Moses at the console of one of our PDP-10s. This was a hall meeting between me and Bill and some other people. This is me sitting with Ramesh Patil, one of my first graduate students. These are terrible pictures, but I couldn't find better versions of them. And so I decided that medicine was probably a good area after meeting these people, because they seem to have really interesting problems to work on. And as I was telling Roger at the coffee break earlier, he was complaining that you could take our proposal from 15 years ago or 17 years ago or something, and it's still very much appropriate. And I said, well, that's great. All good problems have that characteristic, that you never solve them, because they give you an infinite series of problems to work on. And for somebody in the education business, this is fantastic, because it means that generations of students can enjoy working on slight variants of that same problem. Hopefully there is some progress. Anyway, at the time, Cass Kulikowski, who was planning on coming today, but his transportation was disrupted by the storm, organized the first AI medicine workshop at Rutgers. And so I met the field of people interested in AI applied to medicine, which at that time consisted of about 25 people around the world. Okay, it was a small group. This is Ted Shortliff, whose PhD thesis had just been published shortly before that first meeting, was on Mycin, which was a rule-based expert system. Ed Feigenbaum was head of the Knowledge Systems Lab at Stanford, was a big advocate of rule-based approaches to decision-making and to modeling human intelligence. Harry Popel and Randy Miller were both at the University of Pittsburgh, and had built a system that was originally called Internist until they got sued for using the copyrighted name. And somebody was mentioning that problem earlier.
Right, Hanover, Microsoft.
Hanover, right. And then they changed it to Dialogue and got sued for using the copyrighted name. And then they called it Internist and got sued for using the copyrighted name. And then they called
QMR.
it QMR, which was not copyrighted. It was quick medical reference was the idea, but it was a pattern matching style of system. We did some similar work. Greg Cooper was my first bachelor's student when he was an MIT undergraduate, has become a distinguished researcher in Bayesian networks, causality, and biomedical informatics. This is Eric Horvitz and David Heckerman, who were at Stanford. These pictures are from a little bit later. I did spend a sabbatical in the late 1980s at Stanford, working with Ross Schachter, Larry Fagan, Mark Mewson, Bruce Buchanan, Blackford Middleton. So that was fun. We used to fight with each other all the time, especially Feigenbaum and I took opposite sides on the rules versus frames debate, which was a hot topic of its era. And of course, nobody remembers this anymore because the answer, as in most such cases, is yes, whatever is appropriate to whatever problem you're working on. And there are, of course, combined ways of doing it, but I remember that was a frequent topic of interesting debate. So this is immodestly a list of all the students whose PhDs I've supervised and whose PhDs I've been a reader on. There are some question marks here for people who are still in process, and so we don't know exactly when they're going to finish. Although I'm optimistic that Sam and Dee will be finished this, actually it should say 2020.
Yeah, 2020.
Yeah, no.
2019 is not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. So, you know, looking at this list, I had never looked at it in this form before, but that's a lot of people, and it worries me slightly. I do remember when I was an undergraduate, Richard Feynman used to come and visit the undergraduate dorms at Caltech, and he'd just come for dinner and sit around and shoot the bull with people. And I remember at one point, he was talking about how he felt guilty about training so many theoretical physicists because there just wasn't that much to do for theoretical physicists. And I look at this list and I go, am I making the same mistake?
No.
But I think not.
We could use double or triple that.
Yeah, I think one of the nice things about being in a more applied field is that there is lots of data and there are lots of problems to work on, and so I don't need to feel guilty about it. But this is really, it impresses me even to look at this list. And then I've had a ton of master's students, some of whom overlap with the PhD students because MIT makes you get a master's degree on the way to the PhD. And then I've had a number of really good bachelor's students. So we used to have bachelor's theses, as Sayun was describing. Now we have advanced undergraduate projects and all sorts of, they're supposed to be smaller things that don't kill people quite as much. But it's been fun. And then this is a very incomplete list, but I've also had a lot of wonderful colleagues. Bill Long has been a member of my group for eternity. As somebody said, he worked on automatic programming and then joined my group when he finished his PhD and converted to working on medical kinds of problems. And I really enjoyed working with him. John Doyle was a principal research scientist for many years. He's now a professor at University of North Carolina State. And then Anna, you met, she's a professor at UMass Lowell. And then some of these, Ken was here earlier, of course, and Zach.
Is the news about John public yet?
I think it's supposed to be public today. So John Halamko was planning on coming to this meeting, and he sends me a note a couple of days ago saying, he's terribly sorry he won't be able to make it because it's being announced today that he's going to be the new president of Mayo Clinic.
Oh, wow.
And so I said, well, that's a pretty good excuse. So I think he's off in Minnesota being announced or something, being given a Mayo T-shirt like the sports stars do. I'm not positive that news is out yet, so if I blew it, don't repeat it.
Apparently, Beth Israel was going to make a public announcement today, and Mayo is going to make a public announcement in 2 days.
I see. Okay. All right.
So it's selfish.
Yeah. So these are just some additional pictures.
Hippies. Sorry.
So this is Bill Swartout, and this is Brian Smith.
Who's the hippie?
This hippie, that's Ken Church,
Wow.
now a distinguished linguist.
Wow.
So he used to look like that. Here's Charlie, Bill. Bob Frankston was briefly my student before he left to team up with Dan Bricklin. They built VisiCalc, which invented the idea of the spreadsheet, the computerized spreadsheet. So he did pretty well. This is Ramesh Patil. This was Bob Brucaleri, who did his master's thesis in my group and then bailed out because he decided he wanted to be a molecular biologist and went to do his PhD with Karplus at Harvard. I actually just saw him. His family is nuts about rabbits, which is very strange.
Live rabbits or?
Live rabbit, pet rabbits. His daughter was there with her pet rabbit wearing a bow tie. The rabbit daughter. And this was Byron Davies, who he and Bob were both members of my group briefly. Brian also went on to a distinguished career. He wrote the longest PhD thesis ever published in computer science at MIT. It was about 800 pages. And I remember accusing him at the time of not having figured out that there's a delete key on the keyboard. And so his style of writing was that he would write something, and then if he decided that it was incorrect, instead of erasing it, he would write a preamble explaining why this is a plausible idea, and then a postscript to it explaining why it was a bad idea.
There's a DSM code for that.
Well, I always attributed it to the fact that his father was a professor of theology at Harvard. And I think Brian had a desire to compete with his father. So this was more theological style argumentation. Anyway, he went on to Xerox PARC and then was at CSLI at Stanford for many years, became a professor at the University of Indiana, doing sort of logic and programming languages, then went on to Duke University, where he was a professor of philosophy, and then went on to the University of Toronto, where he became dean of computing.
I met him.
Yeah.
He was at a dinner. He said, "I know you. You're Szolovits." Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So he was one of my students.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people have mentioned that I let my students do whatever they want to do. In most cases, this works out really well, because they're smarter than I am, and certainly by the time they get to doing their theses, they are much more knowledgeable about whatever topic they're studying than I am. And so it seems like a good heuristic to say, you know, we get really good students, we vet them very carefully when they come in, we torture them a bit, and if they survive the torture, then we say, well, okay, now you can go do whatever you want. So the only case in which I had some regrets was in Brian's case, because he did a magnificent thesis, but it was magnificently too long. So I remember Marvin Minsky was interested in the work that he was doing. So he was going to come to the defense, and he calls me the morning of the defense from New York saying that he got stuck at some meeting. He's not going to be able to come. And I said, well, Marvin, do you have any advice for Brian? And he said, yes, tell him to toss out every second word. Anyway, really wonderful work on the semantics of programming languages and the development of introspective programming in Lisp-like languages. You've seen some of these pictures repeatedly because we all use the same trove of photographs. So these are mostly from the 1980s into the early 1990s. Another interesting student was Bob Kunstadter.
Wow.
Bob was an MD from Montreal who came and did a master's thesis with me and Octo Barnett at Mass General. And then Daisy, his wife, was doing a master's degree in public health at the Harvard School of Public Health at the same time. When they both finished, they decided to walk home to Montreal. And they did. And they said, wow, this is really fun. So then they went off and went to a trekking school in Montana where they spent 6 weeks learning how to be trekkers. And then Daisy's brother, who lived in Quito, Ecuador, was starting some kind of computer-based company. And so they went down to Quito, not walking, to help the brother. And when they finished helping him set up the business, they said, well, we should practice our trekking skills. And so they hiked from Quito, Ecuador to Tierra del Fuego and back. This is inconceivable, right? It is a very, very long trip.
That's half the circumference of planet Earth, basically.
Yeah, basically going around Mars.
Yeah.
They walked Mars.
Yeah.
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 So it took them a year. They came back to Quito. They decided that was so much fun, they did it again.
The same walk.
Well, it was almost the same walk. The second time they walked back along the coast and they stopped in Valparaiso, which is the headquarters of the Chilean Navy. And they talked the Navy into letting them catch a ride to Antarctica on the Navy resupply mission to the Antarctic station that Chile maintains there. And so they did some hiking in Antarctica and played with penguins and came back and then walked the rest of the way back to Quito. And now they actually run an ecotourism business where they take people on hikes through Bolivia and Peru and down the Amazon.
Wow, I just realized we had a Forrest Gump before there was Forrest Gump.
So, I mean, everybody in these pictures has had a really interesting career, but they're probably the most oddball in terms of what is likely to happen to somebody who graduates from MIT. This was at the Stanford Auditorium. Somebody had referenced already that we had this AI medicine meeting at Stanford back in the good old days. So this is mostly MedG in this row. And here's Heckerman and some Stanford people and various folks along there. I think that's Greg, if I see it correctly, and Larry Kingsland from LLM and so on. So a lot of old familiar faces. And here's Seyun enjoying the telephone, and I think a Lisp machine console in front of her, on which probably the work that you were describing was done at the time. This is one of the Tablet House meetings, beautiful place. Unfortunately, MIT sold it, so we can't go back and repeat that experience. I don't know why they sold it, but it's an old farmhouse across the street from Suicide 6 ski area. It's a ski area.
Okay.
Wonderful place. We had several meetings there where I would be able to take the group up and we'd have a retreat and sit around talking about things. These were some of the participants. So Dan Nygren, who was here earlier, there's Dwayne, Ying, Mojda, John, Yao Sun, Chris, looking
Pensive or drugged.
I think it's a bad picture.
Yes, it's a bad picture.
And I'm trying to solve a puzzle that I never did solve. It was one of these physical puzzles that my geometric skills were not good enough.
There was a attendee at that who she was still might be a doctor at Children's, and she was very competitive. And Chris actually solved the puzzle, but no one was looking, or she thought no one was looking. Pulled it apart.
This is an adult?
Yes.
Oh.
In fact, she was head of the CCU.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Or the NICU.
NICU. The NICU. Yeah.
NICU, yeah.
A very practical person.
Yeah.
It's only one way to another.
Right. Yeah.
So these are some slightly more recent people. Alex Ye is now at MITRE. Caleb Hug is at Microsoft. Bob Rudin is at Rand Corporation. Andrea, I don't know what Andrea is up to nowadays. She's been everything from starting up companies to being an actress to being a consultant to various things. Rohit, you saw in some of Siyun's pictures, he was in her lab and then came and did a postdoc with me. Yona Zhang was a very smart Korean woman who couldn't speak English when she arrived. She could read and write English wonderfully well, but she couldn't speak it to save her life. So the way we would communicate is I would write things to her and she would write things back to me because I couldn't understand her speech. And it took a year or something before she could speak English well enough that we could actually communicate in a more normal way. So at some point I asked her, how could she be so good at written English, but so bad at spoken English? And she said, well, the Korean school system at the time taught English because it was important for people's scientific careers to be able to read and write in the international market of ideas. But the people who taught this actually didn't know how to speak English either. They were other Koreans who had learned the same way. And so they taught spoken English in ways that were incomprehensible to people who actually spoke English.
That's a secret language that Koreans who speak that kind of English can only speak.
Right.
I guess that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It could be like Navajo or something.
Exactly.
Anyway, so Yona, when she graduated, she went to Bell Labs, which was just falling apart at the time. This was after the breakup of AT&T. And she eventually got into management, and her job was firing people.
Nice.
And at some point, she decided to fire herself, and then went into industry, not research labs. Eventually became chief technology officer of the Samsung Corporation.
Wow.
And oversaw like a $3 billion redesign of their international computing infrastructure. And last time I looked, she's a professor at McGill in the management school. So she's gone over to the dark side, but very successfully. And then these are, this is Alicia, who I was just talking to yesterday. These are some of Randy Davis's students. This is a more recent photograph, but this is Reed Simmons now at CMU, Jeff Van Balen in where is Jeff? Wyoming, University of Wyoming. Walter Hampshire, who's a consultant. I didn't get pictures of all those students. And then these are more recent people, many of whom are in the room. Here's me and Yuan, me with Tristan, me with So I got a husband and wife team of PhD students a couple of years ago. This is Frank Thurnell-Court and Jenny Lee.
Was it independent admission, or was it independent admission, or were you given the choice all or nothing?
So what happened is I took on Frank as a student. Jenny was actually working in Lids on some optimization problems. And I think Frank convinced her that the kinds of things we did in my group were more interesting. And so she switched. But they're an interesting couple. She's Korean, he's French. And so when they got married, they had a civil wedding in Boston, they had a religious wedding in France, and they had a traditional Korean wedding in Korea. So it was quite a to-do. This is Varesh Prasad. I was on his thesis committee with Tom Helt. And this is Marcia, who you saw earlier, obviously.
So we have to leave in 2 minutes because our cars need to pick her up.
I'm almost done. In fact, my next slide. But I just wanted to sort of touch on one more issue, which is how I see the evolution of this field over 45 years that I've been in it now. So 45 years ago, we had no data. And so the only game in town was expert systems. So we would bludgeon our medical collaborators into revealing to us what was it that they knew so that we could embed those things in computer programs. And that was pretty successful. It was actually remarkably successful for demonstrating that this was not a crazy idea. It wasn't very successful in any sort of practical sense because the systems we built tended to work really well on the cases that we had imagined them to work on. And they had a very sharp fall off at the edges. So if we hadn't thought about some case, then the system probably did terribly badly on it. It could give you an explanation of why it was acting that way, and so you could sort of figure out what was wrong with it. But it was clearly not scalable to fix these systems by twiddling the models or by adding rules or by whatever technique you wanted to use. And so what happened is that by the mid-1990s, there was a dramatic increase in the amount of data that was available. And Roger, I think, was really one of the people who realized and made it happen that data, which was being collected by hospital information systems, could be useful and could be captured and could be made available to people doing research. So I remember when Ira Heimowitz became a PhD student in my lab, I was trying to get him to pick up some ideas from Tom Wu's PhD thesis, which was a diagnosis thesis based on search. And he had outlined some ideas about how to add probabilistic reasoning to those search problems. And I wanted Ira to work on that. And he turns to me and he says, well, Pete, I don't want to work that hard. Why don't we just learn stuff from data? And I said, nah, it'll never work. And it worked. And so since then, none of my students want to work that hard, or rather they want to work hard on different kinds of problems. And they're now all working on deep neural networks and explainable systems and all kinds of stuff like that. So there's definitely evolution in what happens in a field over time. And I'm pretty optimistic that there will continue to be that kind of evolution. I am delighted that so many of you are continuing to work in this field because it makes me feel like I'm not as alone as I was when the entire community could fit in one modest-sized classroom. So thank you all. And I'm deeply honored that you put on this show and Ego Fest for me. And thank you very much.
Now we only have to wait 9 years until the next one, apparently.
Right, yes. Well, unless you do one for 75, if I'm still alive.
I'm more optimistic than Marcia.
All right, thank you all. I think
Thank
that's
you all.
that's the end of the festivities.
That is. I go play amongst yourselves.
So at MIT, we would take all those leftover lunches, put them out on the table, and announce to a mailing list called Vultures that it's available. If you have some
We have an equivalent mailing list, which I will.
deserving students who could read it, that would be good.
I will